Hey guys, welcome to my TED Talk. Before I tell you the topic of this talk, I'm going to show you some different pictures. Do you recognize him? Probably. It's The Rock. What about him? Barack Obama? Her? Angelina Jolie. Now what's pretty interesting about those three pictures that I showed you is that humans can actually recognize faces. We can be given a picture of a famous person and recognize them in milliseconds. We know just from looking at one picture of one face who that human is, who that individual is. We can also do this with friends, family. We can recognize them from a distance, from close up, really easily. We do this every day in our lives. We can also recognize if someone's a stranger, if we don't know their face, we can easily recognize, hey, I've never seen that face before. But what's interesting, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this, is can animals do this? Can animals who look so like each other actually pick each other out of a crowd and recognize each other as individuals? Can zebras in a herd recognize each other? Look how similar these zebras are. Can they actually look at each other and say, hey, I know you, you're that guy? Can zebras actually pick out faces in a crowd? What about other animals like zebras, lions, elephants, mammals of all kinds? Can they do this? What about in the ocean, when your vision is definitely changed in the ocean because of the light rays and everything like that? Can animals that see in the ocean, can they recognize each other? Can sharks look at another shark and know who that is? Can they know if it's a stranger shark or a shark that they've seen before? Insects do a lot of amazing things, but can they pick out their faces from a crowd? You might be surprised by the answers, and I've done some research on different articles, and there's actually a lot of scientists that have done this research and looked for animals that can recognize each other in the same species. The first study that I looked at was done by Dr. Tibbet, and she actually looked at the paper wasp. And when you think about animals recognizing each other, you might not think about insects, because you don't really think, hey, insects aren't that smart. If anyone can recognize each other, it's probably the mammals, the monkeys, things that are closest related to us. But she actually found some really interesting things when she looked at the paper wasps. So this is a paper wasp that I have on the screen, your normal wasp. And you might be thinking, do insects even have a face? I would say so. You do a close-up, this is different faces of a paper wasp. They can actually be varied. You can actually have different markings on the paper wasp that look different ways depending on the individual. So what Tibbet did was she actually did two things. The first thing she did was make a maze, and she put one wasp in the maze at the beginning, and the maze would actually go straight forward and then go out into a T. And on one end, she would put a picture of one individual, something like this on the screen. She would take one of these individuals and put their picture up there. And on the other end, she would put a picture of a different individual. So the subject wasp, the wasp that was alive, not a picture, the real wasp, she put it in this maze, and then the wasp would go forward into the T, and it would pick one of the individuals. And whichever individual it picked, she would reward it with food to say, hey, if you go to this individual, you're going to get rewarded with food. Now, if we place the same wasps in the same pictures and we reran this test, would the wasp remember which of the pictures gave it food? Would it remember, oh, if I see this wasp face, I'm going to get rewarded with food? The wasp remembered. It remembered based on the pictures of faces which of the wasp was actually going to give it a reward. So it had facial recognition of these wasps. It was able to tell. It was able to remember for long periods of time, if placed in a maze, which wasp to go to based on just a picture, not even the actual wasp. So we know it's not smell or pheromones. We know it's just visual recognition. Another thing she did was she actually took a colony of wasps. So these wasps live in a colony. They have queens. And she took one of these wasps, she took it out, and she actually painted on its face. And what she would do was take, say, one of these wasps and paint it and give it different markings on its face. So that kind of like if we were to take our face and do markings on it, so we wouldn't be able to recognize each other as easily. So after she took one wasp from the colony and painted on its face, she would then return it to its colony and see what happened. Did the rest of the colony still remember the wasp? Was it able to tell, hey, that's Fred and he just has face painting? Or was it like, that's a new wasp? So what actually happened was when she put the wasp back into the colony, it got met with a bunch of aggression. All the other wasps were like, who the heck are you? Get out of here. You do not belong in our colony. So this wasp was met with aggression time after time. Each wasp she took out and painted its face to look unrecognizable, the wasp didn't recognize them anymore. They didn't go off smell or pheromones again. They were just looking at these wasps' face and said, hey, we don't know who you are, bud. Get out of here. When in fact, that wasp had been in the colony all along. It just had some facial markings on it. So that's a really cool example of animal facial recognition and kind of an unsuspecting species, a wasp. So other species do this. There's actually a lot of species that can recognize individuals. But what about species that aren't recognizing by their face, their faces? What about species who can recognize maybe by calls or sounds? You might think of birds, for example, and there's a lot of birds that can do this, but I thought one cool example was actually the bottlenose dolphin. So researchers have looked into the bottlenose dolphin whistles and calls, and they've actually found that these dolphins have these signature whistles that almost act like a name. They come up with a certain signal when they're young, say, and that's their whistle, and no one else does that whistle, just them. It almost becomes their name. So when they're approaching another pod of dolphins, they can whistle their name whistle, and that pod may recognize them, or they may recognize, hey, I've never heard that whistle before, who's this guy? And so what researchers did was they used a microphone and sound waves, and they looked at all these signature whistles, and here's an example of 3 different dolphins with 3 different signature whistles. It's almost like their written name. They have these whistles, and people know, or the dolphins know which dolphin has which whistle. So that's really pretty interesting. The final study I did was looking at, okay, some animals can recognize each other as individuals, but what about across species? Can animals actually recognize faces of a different species? So, scientists, for this example, have looked at the crow. So in this experiment, the crow was looked at, and what happened was a bunch of researchers, what they did was put masks on. And they're actually very creepy masks that I don't have a picture of, but kind of look not scary, but creepy. And these researchers, about I think 5 of them, put these masks on, and they went out into the woods where crows were, and they started to tag crows. So crows obviously don't like being tagged, they don't like being caught, this causes stress on the crow. And these researchers tagged a bunch of crows, they kept the masks on the whole time, and they left. A few days later, what they did was they came back with the masks on still, the same masks that they used to tag the crows the first time, and what they were met with was aggression by these crows. These crows remembered these researchers. They remembered they got tagged the first time, and they don't want to be tagged again. And these researchers were met with a bunch of aggression from the crows swooping, diving. The crows remembered them. So yes, the crows remembered them. That's cool. But the cooler thing was that a few days later, the researchers came back without masks, their normal face on, and the crows couldn't care less. So that proves that the crows were actually recognizing the faces of the researchers, whether it masks or not. They were looking at facial features. They weren't looking at their bodies, their stance. They weren't looking or smelling anything. It was actually the mask that they recognized, these facial features. So that actually showed scientists that crows can actually remember faces. So don't be mean to any crows because they'll remember you. So why would that be beneficial? Animals can recognize each other as individuals. That could help with some pecking order, especially in the wasp example. They have a pecking order where they'll be aggressive and do subordinates and they'll have different queens, and so recognizing individuals can help sort that out. You can also recognize strangers as individuals. That would help. If you can recognize the people you know as animals, you can also recognize people that aren't part of your crowd, and that could reduce threats or help you understand what is a threat and what's not. And it's just really cool that animals are able to look at each other's faces and do some of the things that we humans think are just human things. Animals are a lot more like us in a lot of ways, but facial recognition and individual recognition, whether it be by sound, by smell, by face, is something that a lot of species will share with us. So I hope you enjoyed my TED Talk, and goodbye.